Sweet. So, super excited to start the spring lecture series off. A couple of first things, cell phones to stun. Let's do that first. Second thing, whoever borrowed, quote unquote, my copy of Geostories from Meg Bunt's desk at the end of last semester, shame on you. Like you got guilt weigh you down until you find me at some point and return my book. Third thing, after the lecture today, there's a reception hosted by undergraduate student council. Speak in the lobby. It starts at 6-ish. So I'll make this really short. I'm really psyched. Our first lecturers, Rania and Hadi Jazairy, who work together as Design Earth. I mean, they don't really need a whole lot of introduction with their firm, which is based on projections in large measure about future landscape. I've just kind of taken off. I mean, the metric I would measure if I was just at the Museum of Modern Arts, reopened, and down in the kind of public gallery, the really vaunted kind of space that they've argued they've opened the museum up to the city. There is the extraordinary kind of portable, could you leave back down? Aluminum oven, and there's a kind of machine that rolls on wind power and finds landmines, and then there's a suite of drawings by Design Earth, which is a great metric to give you some sense of where they are right now in the kind of critical landscape. The other reason I'm really excited about the fact that they're here is, this is professional education, and I think the professional definition of professionalism is honesty. And I think that we can be honest about what we do well, like we hire out really well. The big metric for a school that we just got, that we're the #1 school for hiring into offices, which means we do that well. But it also means that we don't do another thing well, which is we don't do the other part of architecture, the non-professional part of architecture, as well as perhaps we should. So I think the idea of having guests come who are particularly capable in that realm is really, really exciting. So with no further ado, I'd like to, I don't want to tell the backstories of these guys. They both are doctors in design from the GSD, and then they've got strange backstories behind that. You can read about that at their website. I'd just like to let you guys do the talking. So Rania, Ghosn and Hadi Jazairy.
All right. Thanks, David, and thank you not just for the introduction tonight, but for a very warm and soft landing in Austin yesterday and today. Now we know why your classes are always so packed and people love you here, just because great stories, great sense of humor, and it goes on and on. So our part, I'm going to be switched on. How's that? Better? Yeah? Much better? Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to begin the semester with you all. We're presenting work today from our book Geostories, which is a work of commitment, and a work of commitment that extends to both a disciplinary question, but also to a broader public question. And you'll hopefully see why soon. So it thinks of the agency of the architectural project in shaping planetary imagination at a moment in particular when climate systems are in crisis. The talk will follow the outline, which is very similar to that of the book. We'll start with a compact, in the sense that it's brief, but it's quite dense introduction to some of the conceptual questions of this design research publication. So around 10 slides. If you hold on through the first 10 slides, then it's much softer. Then we'll follow with a series of 3 projects, one from each section of the book, which is organized into terrarium, aquarium, and planetarium. So we'll share one from these projects. Stories matter to the Earth. The conditions of the current environmental crisis have relied on narratives of industrial modernity, about the world as resource, about nature as external, about progress as an escape from nature's determinations and limits, and about technology as quasi-autonomous prime mover. We argue that spatial representation is complicit in the perpetuation of such stories and myths, such as this image from the gas and oil company, Total, in its promotional campaign, Common Interest, which is structured with this rigid and binary symmetry between the metropolis on one side and the extractive hinterland, kind of not as obvious as that, but that's what it is on the other hand. And such clean carbon urbanism has rested on a series of technological infrastructures that allow the extraction of resources from entities which are typically politically and geographically beyond this island, this Manhattanism's jurisdictions, while they divest the center of the environmental costs of urbanizations. Economists commonly use the term externalities to refer to such costs, which are unaccounted for in entrepreneurial outlays and are shifted to and ultimately borne by third parties or the community as a whole. Stories of the earth have long rested on such models and binaries of nature and culture, of Manhattanism and extractive hinterlands, which abstract the geographies of such externalities. They leave out refineries, pipelines, carbon dioxide pollution, public health concerns, and the degradation of shared commons to make possible this transformation of the earth into an economic resource. In this worldview, the ecomimetic rendering, the collage of the photograph, switches off political vigilance on how to organize the work and its resources. In an epoch of environmental risks, environmentalists brought to our attention that there are actually no externalities, no outside in which the unwanted consequences of our actions can disappear from view. Paradoxically, though, while the threats are serious, we remain little mobilized, in part maybe because of the poverty of the environmental imagination. The environmental crisis might not be a calamity of the physical environment only, but also a calamity of the cultural environment, of the systems of representation through which society relates to complex environmental issues in their vast scales of space and time. So what do we story? At a moment when we can no longer imagine the world without technology and a world without environmental disaster, we might need to learn to tell other stories in which externalities are integral rather than incidental to narratives of the earth. When Dr. Frankenstein met his creation on a glacier in the Alps, the monster claimed that it was not born a monster at all, but that it became destructive only after being left alone, abandoned in the laboratory by his horrified creature the moment he twitched to life. That's the analogy that the philosopher Bruno Latour wants us to think of when we're thinking of stories of political ecology now, that this is not a nature that is external to us, but this is a nature that is always already transformed by various systems. So the responsibility is not to stop the transformation, but to continue to bear attention to them, to the moment when they become obsolete or to when we find the next best story. So what can we think of? Well, I guess one is to look at Frankenstein, to make visible the unevenness between the promise of these technological systems and the actual deployment of geographic externalities, but also not just to look at Frankenstein, but to stay with Frankenstein, to speculate on a world in which technologies are not necessarily perfect, but in which we learn to stay with their troubles, to quote the philosopher Donna Haraway, as the only ethical option for this environmental and technological future. Not to hope in a technology that is utopian in the sense that it will fix all problems, but to accept that externalities will always be part of a future, and the challenge is to remain with them, to accept them, to design with them, with the landfills, with the mine pits, with the oil rigs, or with future externalities. The challenge is to produce accounts that are even more fantastic than those of the photographs of extractive industrialism, and maybe accounts, representations that could encapsulate that which scientific rationalization alone, be it in architectural circles of diagram flows or renderings, maybe has alone failed to communicate. So what are these accounts? Well, for us, for Design Earth, aesthetic practice and also aesthetic education, because we are also educators, is the instrument for training a planetary ethical impulse that solicits a geographical imagination and through that makes public in the sense that it makes visible, it makes critical, it makes speculative, and it assembles people around a new picture of the Earth. It's almost like this Yves Klein globe terrestre bleu, which the planetary terrestrial, the blue planetary globe, which was produced in 1957 when he declared that the whole world is blue. And he marked that occasion by creating a model in his trademarked blue Klein in kind of a subtle relief, and he portrayed it as levitating in space out of the stand and axis to make it easier to contemplate, to really place it as an object. It's 4 years later, in April 1961, that the cosmonaut Gagarin commented, "The Earth is an intense deep blue." And the rest is history with the famous then blue marble photograph that is compiled from satellite data. Somehow, this is an argument that we still want to think through, but we believe that the image of the blue marble might have reached its limit in terms of how much it's capable of soliciting a planetary imagination and intervention. And maybe there's a call again on an aesthetic practice that is capable of evoking, contemplating, and acting on a planet, maybe in a slightly more affirmative way. So how do we convert into image and narrative these disasters that are slow-moving and long in the making? Perhaps speculative narrative and its persistent engagement with technological questions in relation to the planet, including those created by broadening risk scenarios, can open up our stories to diversity and trouble. Rachel Carson, which book The Silent Spring was credited with advancing the global movement, demonstrates a communicative passion responsive to diverse audiences, indeed the passion that has helped shape such audiences by refusing to adhere to conventional disciplinary or professional expectations. In struggling to give shape to toxicity, Carson resorted to a narrative form. A Fable for Tomorrow, the opening chapter from Silent Spring, it introduces a town, and I quote, "a town in the heart of America that awakes to a birdless, budless spring. This town does not actually exist," Carson concludes, "but it might easily have 1,000 counterparts in America or elsewhere in the world. For a grim spectre has crept upon us, almost unnoticed, and this imagined tragedy may easily become the stark reality we all shall know." End of quote. So the purpose of such fabulations is not to fix the future, but to raise questions on present and past relations between humans and the worlds that they inhabit. So what are the disciplinary tools for such an aesthetic engagement? Design Earth deploys geoaesthetic forms of environmental engagement, and in particular, the architectural drawing. Drawing, for us, becomes an argument about the world. It's at once descriptive, synthetic, critical, and always speculative. The section drawing, in particular, counteracts the abstract Earth or aerial mappings of diagrammatic flows and soft perspectives, which is not dissimilar to how it had appeared in natural history with the split view, also known as the aquarium view, that shows domains both above and below the surface or the ground. So it's asking us always to think of the Earth relationally, sectionally. It projects this vertical territory that invites us to imagine the different relation between not only the different forces of the Earth, but also the different disciplines that typically thing the Earth. So that's how we draw on the geographic imagination to design with externalities, to make legible the geographies of technological systems, visualize how they change the Earth, and foreground them as elements of design. Speculative architectural fiction becomes the method to intervene representationally, to plot and give figurative shape to environmental threats, all while keeping the future open to possibilities of design intervention. And these are some of the broad strokes of the introduction to the book. It's a call for an environmental imagination that renders sensible the issues of climate change, and through geographic fiction invites readers to relate to the complexity of Earth systems. The book is organized into, or it includes a series of 14 architectural projects on technological externalities, such as oil extraction, deep sea mining, ocean acidification, pollution, space debris, and a host of other ecological issues. And it's structured into 3 sections: terrarium, aquarium, and planetarium, each of which revisits these devices of wonder to assemble publics around these representations of the Earth. So today we'll share with you a geostory from each section, from the geological depth of fossil fuel extraction to this deep sea and then outer space. And they address questions of representation, of what world one wants to assemble, and with what entities she wants to live.
Terrarium. Frustrated by the death of his plants in polluted East London, surgeon and amateur botanist Nathaniel Ward devised a case of glass and metal that was shown in a great exhibition of 1851. Ward's display at the Crystal Palace set off the craze for the small glass structure later termed terrarium, as part of a Victorian popularization of botany, geology, and other sciences of the earth. If Ward's aim was to encase a small parcel of purified air, what might a terrarium look like if it accounted for and represented the environmental conditions of smoke, waste, pollution he was trying to keep at bay? To read fossil Earth, we must become conscious of geological dimensions, of the layers of material entombed in the Earth's crust, as you see here in the section. We must see the Earth in a section cut that describes the world hidden to the layers of the Earth, the spaces of fossil fuels and those of landfills, to make visible the connections and challenges across the subsoil, the external structure of the planet. Over the past 200 years, and in particular after World War II, the fossil fuel industry, first coal, then oil, then natural gas, has produced spectacular economic growth in the form of an abundant and cheap energy machine. Cheap in as far as the industry has divested itself from the environmental transformations brought about by the global expansion of the extractive frontier. Oil has since shed its developmental promises. After Oil was commissioned for Kuwait's pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, the project proposes 3 speculative tales to explore the geography of a major oil-producing region, the Persian Gulf, in the decades after oil. Each project stages and extrapolates critical issues of today's oil landscape for sites of extraction, such as Das Island, sites of transit logistics, such as the Strait of Hormuz, as well as sites of oil spill, such as Bubiyan Island. Collectively, they render visible the embeddedness of the oil system, inviting us to consider the consequences of oil extraction. The first project is Das Island. It lies 160 kilometers off the coast of Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Since the first expedition in the region in 1953, Das Island has developed into a major oil and gas industrial facility where Abu Dhabi processes, stores, and exports crude pumped at offshore fields. Such exports are a mainstay to the economy and a main driver of the urbanization of Abu Dhabi that you see in the back and its sisters emirates such as Dubai, with many of the country's iconic buildings built from oil wealth. Yet, this relationship between the wealth of the surface and the impoverishment of the underground are not presented simultaneously. Thus, crude makes visible such displacement of value in oil urbanism by collapsing The two sites, the drawing is both a timeline and a section. UAE's architectural landmarks are indexed in relation to the geological depth and times of extractions of depleted oil reservoirs. Here you see 3 of them, bringing into visibility the verticality and volume of the state territory. The after of after oil, Das Island, is that of the race to the last drop of oil in the ground to dig deeper below the ground and build higher above earth. The project recovers the excavated volumes of soil and stone, the insides of the earth that spilled out to build a landform monument to the age of oil. This is the second site, the Strait of Hormuz. It is a critical oil transit choke point. 20% of oil traded worldwide moves by tanker across this 30-mile wide passage. The strait was never actually shut down in spite of persistent anxieties of its possible obstruction around frictions, notably the long-running dispute between the UAE and Iran about a few islands. In after oil, the revenues of oil futures, which is the legal contract name for the trade of oil between buyers and sellers, perpetuates the traditional rivalry between these countries on both sides of the Gulf by financing another territorial board game, somehow from risk to monopoly. The grand chessboard repurposes the strait into a real estate territorial game of speculative urbanism between the traditional adversaries across the Gulf, those who call it the Persian Gulf and those who call it the Arabian Gulf. Each chess piece is an iconic project from the history of speculative urbanism, Plan Voisin, Delirious New York, and the Metabolists. This is the third site. The end of the Persian Gulf War in 1991 was accompanied with the geotrauma described by Werner Herzog in one of his movies, or what is considered as the world's largest oil spill, which drastically affected Kuwait's coastal environment. Beyond the intensity of such an event, the oil industry, with its business as usual, increasing rates of carbon emissions, puts the world through a slower and maybe invisible violence, not the spectacular one described by Werner Herzog. The Bubiyan Island is one such sacrificial geography of climate change, a flat and muddy and low landscape vulnerable to sea level rise. There once was an island gives form to such invisible threats. A series of vertical nabkhas elements are inserted into the highest 16 elevation mounts of the island to stabilize its shrinking shorelines into 16 Edenic archipelagos, Edenic islands. So the project halts all major development works to transform the area into a main tourist resort, retaining only the bridge that connects the mainland to one of the islands. The archipelago continues to be uninhabited by humans. Their grounds and waters restage a Garden of Eden of some sort, hosting sea turtles, antelopes, and diverse other forms of wildlife that withstands the temperature and acidity change associated with anthropogenic climate change. After oil is not a mere switch in energy producers. It is a reform of the geographic imagination that both redeems carbon from abstraction as well as rescues all green energy sources from idealism and depoliticization. The political success of our desired transition to non-carbon forms hinges on such a reform of the imagination. To project formally and politically sensible visions of power in the sun belts, in the fields, and wind corridors of the world. This is another project that I would like to share, aquarium. Among the many early handbooks on aquarium care is Ocean Gardens, which admonishes readers to appreciate nature. The mind requires a special education without which the eye and the ear perceive but little of the miracles passing before them. It adds, the wonders of the ocean floor do not reveal themselves to vulgar eyes. Born out of the desire to represent the inaccessible, expansive, and mysterious sea, the aquarium gave a new aesthetic to the idea of evidence, marrying speculation and fantasy with scientific and technological knowledge production to create a submarine chamber of wonder of some sort. This call to educate the eye is timely to remember at a moment where humans are altering the ocean environment at unprecedented rates. Oceans are the biggest resources for life, but they are also the biggest dumping grounds, as well as the largest anthropogenic carbon sinks, acidifying and warming up as ocean absorb more excess heat energy generated over the last 50 years. We are, of course, most familiar with the threats of such volumetric transformations when we talk about sea level rise and the impact on coastal areas. The ocean is a classic example of global commons. The law of the sea and maritime law are a body of both domestic law and public international law. They have governed relations between nations with respect to navigational rights, mineral rights, and jurisdictions over coastal waters. However, these bodies of law do little to nothing to protect deep volumes of ocean from industrial activities, the seabeds. The ocean seabed has been for long protected from exploitation by some of these laws. But today, countries and international corporations are racing to claim deep sea rare earth minerals, mineral resources for the production of batteries and alloys. The site of the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone here, the CCZ in the Pacific Ocean, an area approximately the size of the United States, has the world's largest deposit of deep sea rare earth minerals. Since 2001, 12 exploration licenses have been granted on the CCZ deep sea bed. And paradoxically, as you can see here in the drawing, areas of particular environmental interest, APEs, were designated to protect biodiversity. So you can see them there at the periphery of the drawing. So these are these areas of environmental interest that have been very conveniently placed at the edge of the extraction site. So the conceptual diagram of Pacific Aquarium proposes to collapse. So the first step of the project was to collapse these protection sites and to overlay them onto the site itself rather than separating mineral extraction from environmental concerns. So the projects consolidate the 9 proposed APEs and overlays them onto the concession. Pacific Aquarium was commissioned by the 2016 Oslo Triennale after belonging. The installation is a grid of 9 modules, each of which embodies the contradictory concern of ecology and economy within the same territory. Such aquarium views reckon with the depth of the ocean, the uncertainties of environmental and technological futures. The drawings bring together the attributes of the aquarium. They depict 3-dimensional cross-sections of the ocean with a split view that shows the environment both above and below the surface. And let me share a few of these drawings. This is one of them. International Seabed Authority mandates the conservation of flora and fauna in the CCZ mining area, suspended by cables from a grid of superficial floats. A terraforming infrastructure relocates linear transects of substrate samples to incubate a benthic ecosystem that will be grafted later onto the depleted seabed once mining is completed, as you can see here below. The sharply toothed comb-like suction machine churn and rip the ocean surface into sediment slurry. Catchment dome caps mining activities on the ocean floor to contain a localized sediment plume. Polluted water is separated from surrounding water, transported into a series of inverted water towers for treatment and gradually released back into the ocean after purification. Deep sea mining produces plumes that smother species and forces them away from their habitats. Cyborg fish colony is a school of worker fish, a hybrid of machine and organism that collects plume into a massive spherical sponge-like nests where toxic particles are regurgitated into a delicacy. The uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere decreases the pH of the Earth's oceans. The vertical tensile structures, which contain high iron concentration of water in its tubes, stimulate photosynthesis in plankton, converting dissolved carbon dioxide from ocean acidification into carbon hydrate and oxygen. Wherever coral reefs, sea turtles, and fish die off, jellyfish bloom. Medusa maize is a jellyfish husbandry scheme for an emerging cosmetic industry. It is also an Anthropocene arena that pits the gelatinous beasts against plankton and sea turtles in a luminescent aquarium. The Parliament of Refugees contains within the same artificial envelope different things and species of the Anthropocene, such as sea turtles, scallops, bleached corals, drowning wetlands, hammerhead sharks, algae, Homo sapiens. The Parliament is organized along a hollow pillar that connects it to the center of the Earth through a submerged volcano. The aquarium reckon as such with the cognitive and affective dissonance between what feels like minute individual concerns and agency and a context of enormous collective impact. It also presents a few significant attributes. The aquarium is a three-dimensional territory that materializes the vertical elements of volume in its inherently sectional elements. The aquarium is also a populated multi-species. You can see here some living species space. It counters images of the sea that presents it as a territory of emptiness, such as Lewis Carroll's evacuated ocean chart. The aquarium is now, rather than the vastly accelerated aesthetic of contemporary Anthropocene representation of exponential infodiagrams, satellite flyover images, such artifacts parlants respond to the slow violence in what one might perceive as a slow medium that slows down through and grounds it into the immediacy of the present. The aquarium is also there in front of you. It is both a model of the world that capitalizes on its dissonance from the real through its transparent yet clearly defined boundary condition. With monsters, storms, and jellyfish on stage, the aquarium is a setting in which the non-speaking and non-human entities operate as devices of estrangement, and it is such aquarium's uncanny ability to draw on multiples, even competing visual textual logics, that is central to its work. It is a device that disturbs, startles, and delights us into new ways of thinking and feeling the earth and the ocean. The aquarium holds vividly in tension the panorama, but also the detail. It stages a slice of the ocean, nesting a range of scales from the micro to the macro, without ever fitting neatly towards an unframeable whole.
So the third section, planetarium. We're back to the iconic Apollo images and photographs that staged the world picture that was global and part of an ecological consciousness. But it was also an image of a standalone planet that is outside of us. We're reminded that we do not live on this blue marble, and as far as that image of the planet symbolizes an objective, but also holistic, impersonal, equitable Earth that is made visible by technological achievements. In 1968, Buckminster Fuller wrote, "We are all astronauts." In his book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, the planet is compared to a vessel hurtling through space with limited provisions and humanity as its crew. For Fuller, the Earth could no longer be thought of as a natural object, but instead it must be reorganized into a huge artificial construct, Spaceship Earth, as this larger universe, the cosmos. So if we are to think of representations of the planetarium, or of, in this particular project, we're brought up to think of our project called Cosmorama, which carries three related values for us. First, of course, Cosmorama is tied to an idea of cosmography, which is, as in graphen, the art of writing. It's a form of an aesthetic knowledge that is acquired through that act of inscription. It draws the physical geography of the Earth together with that of outer space. Very similar to what the geographer Alexander von Humboldt has proposed to call a portrait of nature, kind of a response to the way, for example, landscape architects have invited us often to think of panoramas, long scrolls. The idea of thinking of nature as a portrait is suddenly something that reorganizes the frame, but in that act of reorganizing also asks us to think of other ways and other attributes of occupying that frame of representation. So how do we think of this new assemblage of sciences and attributes, and one that could communicate both to the scientific audience as as the life trajectory as of Humboldt, but also become part of a broader public culture, this kind of a scholarship that becomes some of the most widely distributed and solved issues of the time. So that's why the Cosmorama is important, first because of its tie to the act of inscription, of writing, of representing the cosmography. But also Cosmorama is cosmopolitics, because by scaling up the concerns of the Earth to that of the extraterrestrial, we have then the ways of explicating relationships, of organizing infrastructure that can help inform the way we organize resources on Earth. So it opens up, it explicates the relations on Earth by drawing on that extraplanetary imagery. Not very dissimilar to the way science fiction makes obvious some of the relationships that organize human life by suddenly drawing on forms of organizations that happen in the cosmos. It also allows us to think of the world as not only an entity that has the recognizable forms of human living, but also draws on other forms of life, both ones that share the planet with us and others that are yet to be imagined. So it expands our social contract to a broader political contract that includes not only human, but also other forms of life. Cosmorama is also important because it's a site of spectacle, not very dissimilar to how the artifacts of the terrarium and the aquariums are media through which we relate to representations of the earth, Cosmorama is a site of spectacle, which is similar to other image machines of the panorama and the diorama, in that they're also forms of popular entertainment. They were then a peep box through which the spectator views a set of scenes that put the cosmos on stage, materializing in the process gods, magnifying some minuscule creatures, and pulling away further places into the relief. Of course, architecture has historically been inflected and shaped by how humans understand and see the cosmos. The Pantheon, for example, incorporates references to celestial gods, the 28-day cycle of the moon, and the 16 directional divisions of the sky, the sunlight that shines through the oculus into the interior, and gods that were identified by a series of meteorological and astronomical phenomena, be it rain, drought, seasons, eclipse, or meteorite showers. So architecture is not only the structure that relates to the cosmos, but it's also the planetarium. It's also the mediated structure, the model of that world. It's the representational device that models the heaven, as is this beautiful example from the 17th century called the Globe of Gottorp, for example, which is almost a 10 feet in diameter globe that showed a detailed map of the Earth's surface on the outside, and within that, a map of star constellations on the inside. So it's this model of the earth and of the heavens that bring together, which allows the viewer to be part of this expanded scale. So we asked, what is this planetarium of the 21st century? And one proposal was our project, the Blue Marble Circus, which was commissioned for the Design Biennale in Boston and installed on the Rose Kennedy Greenway in the summer of 2017. The Blue Marble Circus is, as the examples of the planetarium, both a physical infrastructure and also a representation of the world. It's interestingly a 1/10 miniature of the Pantheon itself. So it renders visible the spherical architecture of the cosmos that is inscribed within this classical structure. The model itself is a 3D construction of an écorché drawing, which peels out the ribs that are missing from that quarter of the Pantheon, and it actually makes visible that spherical architecture by rendering a blue marble within that, in that structure. So the blue marble, the symbol of the environmental imagination, is here rendered in the actual material construction language of the fossil fuel industry, particularly as it intersects architecture. So the extruded polystyrene foam here in a 10 feet diameter globe that is made of 32 white foam polygonal panels, which are machined on a 5-axis CNC router, so you get this curved, smooth surface on the outside and a polygonal cut on the inside. The totality is shrink-wrapped in marine industrial film in this plastic blue, and the totality is staged within the wooden structure, so that the globe is also a camera obscura. It projects within it the surroundings on the interior surface of the globe. And here you see a model of that structure as it's operative. So the camera obscura part with Atlas holding the weight of the world on his shoulders, and then you see the actual structure in the background. So this is what you get inside. The visitor peeks into the hollow chamber, and after a minute or so, depending on how patient you are, the conditions of the light, the smell of the glue, many other things. But when your eyes have adjusted to that darkness, you begin to recognize an image, an inverted image of the world, in this case of the tree canopies that were on the greenway that are projected onto the interior facets of the globe. So what are some of these? Imagine that if you were actually seeing some of these projections of these days, like embody it with some of these narratives of the sky days that would be projected in this blue marble circus. And you get one of them, which is the one that we're about to share. Particularly now, as extraplanetary geographies have become a matter not only of political concern, but also of economic concern, with the expansion of the extractive imagination beyond the Earth. So you've seen images of the car launching, the Elon Musk car launching into space with the "Do not panic" sign on it, almost a sign of some of the possibilities of exiting spaceship Earth as a way of thinking of an alternative future, but also the promises that are part of the industries that capitalize on outsourced industries for water, platinum groups, and other riches to think about the future beyond the Earth. Some of the companies include Planetary Resources, for example, that aim to send the worms of low-cost robotic spacecraft to extract resources in these near-Earth asteroids. So that's where science and fiction become particularly interesting, and that science is always already looking at the near future in its speculation. It accepts the possibility of speculating as a scientific methodology of putting a mission into Mars on its calendar. So usually scientists are the ones who are easiest at boards with some of these speculation. So part of the question is, how does a design culture begin to respond as this new space age as a matter of public concern? And particularly given the importance of some of these sites, such as planetariums and natural history of museum interest, in communicating these questions to a very broad audience, one that is not divided along professional expertise and lay lines, one that has no particular political affiliation that is restrictive. So museums are by kind of as a project, democratic institutions. At least that's how they were founded in the United States in particular. They were not part of a kind of a monarchy that were then open to the public. They were founded as truly kind of republican projects of a project of democracy. So how could these tools that were part of this project continue to be tools to think of the space age? So the project here is Cosmorama. It was the contribution to the US Pavilion, Dimensions of Citizenship at the 2018 Venice Biennale. It charts the territories of outer space in 3 stories that speculate on this expansion of private industry interests in what was the province of all mankind. So you'd see it's a story that is not very dissimilar to the one that Hadi earlier shared about the deep ocean. These were part of what we refer to as the global commons, which include Antarctica and the governing Antarctic Treaty, bound to expire and be renegotiated, the global, the deep sea of the oceans and the high seas, and also outer space. These are, as we'll share, part of the territory that was supposed to be a province for all mankind, the original language, or the kind of more politically correct language of nowadays of humankind. So the 3 geostories fictions here are organized vertically, so you read them in a series of, the first one is the planetary, the mining the sky, the second one is the planetary arc, and the third one is the Pacific Cemetery. So, of course, aside from the daunting logistics of how do you send that set of robots into outer space, the main obstacle is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which then, mindful of Cold War animosity, had decreed that no celestial body is subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of user occupation, or by any other means. The language was quite conclusive then. But it has recently been violated by national commercial spatial legislation, such as the recent US Space Act of 2015, that allows US citizens to engage in the commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources. So you find it, you keep it. And it's a business proposition that has appealed to other countries as well. So Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, and others have picked up on this models of registering corporations in their national legislation and then allowing those companies to basically appropriate mineral resources in space. Think of it as manifest destiny gone cosmic. So Mining the Sky speculates on the landscapes of this 2015 US Space Act, and it's of course an acronym for Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act. I mean, the great thing about acronyms is that they make sense first and then you need to figure out every word in that title, but still. So the first drawing is the architecture of the new space age, which makes visible the intertwined and conflicting interests that are part of making visible, legislating, governing this operation, including the Oval Office, the United Nations, the Wall Street operations, a broad set of libraries of governance, and ending up with the dome of kind of exploring the skies and charting it. So the captured asteroids are then despun and towed to a mining depot at a point called the Earth-Moon Lagrange point, the first one. It's a position where the combined gravitational pull of the Earth and the Moon make it that you can keep a body in space at that point with zero energy. So it's stabilized by the forces of gravity. And at that point, these asteroids are powered through these large solar farms. They're carved out, so they're either hollowed out for the space resources, or you mine the surface to carve out the spaces of the gods of the new space age. So that's the cosmic Rushmore. And then it's a mission partnership between NASA and US Air Force to maintain the security of these rare earth storage at Lagrange point. It's interesting to note that the history of axonometry itself as a mode of representation is tied to actually the structures of defense. So to see it come back in the modes of drawing, but here at a cosmic scale, and interestingly, where the distance between the Earth and the Lagrange point is closer to that between, say, Florida and the space of the CCZ that Hadi was talking about. So it's not that far if you think about it. So once these are fortified, then some scientists speculate that you can actually begin to travel between these various points, kind of an interstellar galactic highway, which is part of the appeal of these resources. They're not really brought to come back on Earth. They're part of an imagination of how do you build if you're shifting resources beyond. The most energy you need is to actually leave the gravity of the Earth. So that's where you spend a lot of the fuel in the space rocket. So if you can leave some of the resources behind and get more on your way to something else, then this proposition becomes quite appealing. So that's, this is the second series. It's called Planetary Arc. It's a collection of living animals, both that were, those that were launched into space on the upper part of the drawing, into space on scientific missions, to test then the survivability of spaceflight for the human body. And we knew then that most of these animals were not returning. It also loads many of the variety of other species that are currently threatened by the sixth mass extinction in Earth history. So that's the Empire State Arc, where the animal marched into the structure. And these animal species, which some of them are already past the brink of extinction on Earth, are sent out each in its cubicle on an arc to the International Space Station, the most extraordinary and expensive infrastructure built, bound to be decommissioned and defunded in 2024. So there's various plans of how do we think of the future of the International Space Station past 2024. So once the International Space Station is repurposed into a microcosm of scientific experimentation, which also could house some of the scientists whose research funding on climate change has been discontinued. They begin to attend to these to these creatures with remarkable care, in spite of, or maybe because of, their imminent disappearance. It's a project that spans a few thousand years. After that, the offspring of these fellow travelers no longer each exists in their cubicle, but becomes this new figure that embarks on a journey to resettle the Earth. The third episode is Pacific Symmetry, which is a vortex spiral island where the decommissioned satellites and other space debris are brought back from orbit at the Point Nemo in the Pacific Ocean. Over the next decades, thousands of satellites will be launched into space and eventually decommissioned after roughly 15 years of operation. So the project builds on a precedent, that of the Pacific Proving Grounds, in which the United States secured an agreement with the United Nations to conduct nuclear testing in sites in the Pacific Ocean between 1946 and 1962. And that's on US territory, actually. So in this project, the US designates Point Nemo as the strategic territory of the space age. At somehow roughly 1,400 nautical miles from the nearest land, Point Nemo is already the cemetery of deorbited spacecraft. So you can find there the Soviet-era Mir space station, the Jules Verne ATV, and other European Space Agency cargo ships, and even a SpaceX rocket. It's dubbed the oceanic point of inaccessibility because of how far it is from any other inhabited point on Earth, continental point, which does not recognize the inhabitants of the Pacific Islands in that narration. So this becomes the landfill of the space age. It's also a planetary terraforming project in which the vestige of these various space objects are recycled into bits of territory and hence bits of sovereignty that could begin to house the climate refugees from various Pacific islands. It's a strategic era directive that also states that the United States, not dissimilar to the precedents of the Proving Ground, would promote the economic advancement, self-sufficiency, and right to self-determination of such planetary refugees against the disappearance of their lands. In the installation, each suspended head is a Janus face of a 3D model of an asteroid from the NASA Open Access website and the related Greek god of whose name it usually carries. It's interesting, that fascination with Greek gods remains in most space exploration. So the miniature of the meteorite has genealogies in both these scientific and mythical representations. It's also a material specimen, the centerpiece of that layout, which was borrowed from the Harvard Museum of Natural History to be staged in that sequence. Apparently, of all the pieces, this was the most expensive piece and the hardest to secure in the installation. But we had to go a few times back and forth to pick one. So of course we envisioned a much larger piece, which was in the order of many millions of dollars that no one agreed to ship. So then we had to go back and find a piece that we really liked because of how it was sectionally cut. So you can read the iron. So there's various categories of meteorites. This is iron rich, and you can see how it oxidizes differently. The other side is very textured, so not very dissimilar from the way the heads eventually ended up in the layout. So it's built out of these tangible material specimens that visitors could relate to, as well as these other representations that could be anywhere from a cosmic scale to a sculptural scale. It's in conversation with again, the French philosopher Bruno Latour, that calls on us to think of another ecological belief system. And we can debate whether the belief system is the necessary called upon imagination here. For Latour, it's represented in the figure of Gaia, which enters the theater of the world. And of course, the appeal of Gaia in this respect is that it inhabits or embodies both the worlds of science, but also that of mythology. It entered the world of science through some of James Lovelock's kind of numerous writings on the subject, but it also speaks of forms of transcendence and forms of mythological connotations, and it's in that tension between science and mythology that Gaia comes to matter. One is tempted also to think that in the context of the environment, myth could be a particularly effective means for storytelling in times of trouble. Myths connect and magnify the cultural and political worlds they engage. Like most stories, they come at truth through the imagination. They describe or explicate a here and a now that is difficult to facilitate in other ways. Myths counter the stories of industrial capitalism with an even more fantastic narrative machine that tells truth to realism. They ascribe agency where it's hard to assign causality. So Cosmorama hacks this speculative myth machine to render sensible this underbelly of the new space age and the event of the Anthropocene. The importance of such wonder-charged narratives should not be overlooked when conceiving planetary relationships anew. After all, environmentalism is foremost a protest on behalf of values, an engagement with the world beyond the tunnel vision of resourcism. And it's tempting to think that such attention to stories and wonders can make us care. Thank you. are up for it.
Well, right at 6, if we have a few minutes for questions, we could do one or two questions here, or we could go downstairs. Anyone have questions immediately? Then let's go downstairs.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.